after we talked through it for a while, I realized it was pretty much wide open. It was whatever you think that might interest them. And after thinking about it for a while, I remembered some events that we had on our power system where we were challenged somewhat from a reliability perspective in maintaining our operating reserves. And really the root of it came from having cheap natural gas. And I thought, there's some real strange irony in having something that is really, really good for your industry and your company and a cheap fuel ended up causing potential reliability issues on your system. So that's where the speech came from, and I thought it was interesting, and the irony in it, and I hope you find it to be interesting too. My role back at TVA is I manage the folks who dispatch our generation fleet. So the folks that make the commitment to turn generators on and off, dispatch them up and down to follow the load. So what you'll hear from me today is the perspective of a guy who's in system operations. This slide shows an overview of what I'm going to cover today. I assumed there would be people of diverse backgrounds here, so I did an overview about TVA. I don't know how many of you are familiar with TVA. Some, if you're in the power business, are probably intimately familiar with us, and some may not be as familiar. So I'm going to do a quick overview of who TVA is and what kind of assets we have. Next, I'll touch on that issue that came up that kind of brought the idea of cheap gas causing reliability issues. I called it generation unit commitment, and it's really about selecting which generators you're going to run and then the impacts to you if something unexpected happens. And then lastly, I thought it would be prudent to touch on potential transmission issues that you can see from changing your generation sources. Unlike gas transmission, the power industry really is very specifically designed to take specific inputs or generators and deliver them to loads, and it's primarily designed to deliver to local loads. So when you make a massive change to an industry where you're changing most of the sources of your generation, you're really changing the power flow on the system in a way that it wasn't designed to handle. So I'll touch on that with a little example from Entergy and some of the neighboring utilities entering into the MISO and what we did in collaboration with those guys to manage some of the issues that we were seeing. First, we'll see a picture of the TVA service area. The dark blue up there is our power service area. The light blue is what we call the watershed area. The TVA is a federal agency, so we have several responsibilities. In the TVA Act, we were assigned the responsibilities of flood control on the Tennessee and its tributaries. We were assigned the task of navigation of the river system. So a lot of what we do is managing a river system, and we were assigned the task of trying to provide economic development for an area that at the time was very impoverished. The power part of TVA really grew out of that economic development initiative. But you can see there we serve a group of power distributors. TVA sells very little power directly to end-use customers. We have a few large industrial customers that we sell power to, but for the most part, we sell our power to about 155 local power companies who in turn then sell that power to those 9 million folks that live in our service area. This slide details our current generation fleet. You'll notice up at the top we've got about 11,000 megawatts of coal. That is our dominant fuel still today, although that is decreasing quite a bit in recent years. Just a few years ago, instead of 41 units, we had 59. Instead of 11,000 megawatts, we had over 15,000 megawatts of coal. So that's declining quite a bit. And our projections going forward are to retire a substantial amount of additional coal capacity. The next line, we have 3 nuclear units, or 3 nuclear plants. We have 6 units. We're one of those few people out there that's adding nuclear capacity. We're adding another unit to our Watts Bar station. It already has an existing plant there. So with that addition, that'll bring us up to almost 8,000 megawatts of nuclear. We hope to have that other unit online by the end of calendar year next year. Next, you'll see TVA's hydro facilities. A lot of people I talk to that aren't from our area kind of associate TVA with hydro. Some people I talk to think that that's all we have is hydro, when in fact hydro is one of the smaller generation fleets that we have. We have 29 dams, but most of them are fairly small. Those are the conventional hydro facilities. We also have 2 other companies in our service area that have hydro systems. We currently take all of the power, almost all of the power off of those facilities. So altogether, we could get about 4,200 megawatts out of our hydro fleet if the conditions are right and we have enough water. We have a pump storage plant located just outside of Chattanooga that's about 1,600 megawatts. If you ever talk to a system operator that has pump storage, they will tell you that pump storage is a system operator's best friend. They're fast, they're flexible, they're big, and they provide you load at night when your big nukes are on, when your coal plants are wanting to stay on. Pumps at night are a great thing for a system operator. We have one other small pump storage unit. It's only 80 megawatts, but for you trivia buffs, it was the first pumper in the U.S. It's at our Hiwassee hydro plant. We have a fairly large combustion turbine fleet, simple cycle combustion turbines at a little over 5,000 megawatts. With a few exceptions, those burn both diesel fuel and natural gas. For reliability reasons, we have diesel fuel backup on most of them, although they almost always run on gas. Next is our combined cycle fleet. It has grown quite a bit in recent years. As the coal fleet has gone down, our combined cycle fleet has gone up. We're also in the process of building a couple of other combined cycle plants. And in addition to those, we almost always are leasing additional combined cycle capacity in our area. We lease right now about 2,000 megawatts of combined cycle capacity from other folks. The most recent addition to the TVA fleet is our wind plants. We're one of only a few people right now that are going out and transporting wind from distant places. Of that 1,500 megawatts, only about 30 of it is in our service area. Of those 839 little turbines, they're scattered from Kansas to Illinois. So we transport those into the TVA region. Most of it we transport in real time. If anybody's interested in how we do that, come see me after the show. It'd take a long time to explain that one, but wind is an interesting new part of our portfolio. And then the last piece we call demand response. That's interruptible customers. It goes by a lot of different names and different flavors. But what that is are customers where we give them a price break in exchange for them allowing us to reduce their power takes from time to time. So it's a nice partnership between us and some of our customers where with most electric utilities, there's a little piece of capacity you honestly only need about once every 5 to 10 years. It's that top tier of your capacity, and it's a good partnership for demand response. Our transmission system is fairly robust. We have a 500 kV high voltage system. It's kind of the backbone of our system. Our primary voltage is 161 kV. That is where we deliver almost all the power to our end-use customers. Again, we sell to local power companies and large industrials. We have very little retail sales. And then we have a hodgepodge of just about every other voltage you can think of that makes up that other 2,200 miles line. This picture shows you an illustration of where our transmission system the lines are located. You can see where some of our major power plants are located. The black lines up there are 500 system. The red lines are the 161, and then the green are some lower voltages. You can see the location of our power plants. You can tell the blue dots up there is our hydro fleet running up the mountains of Tennessee and somewhat into North Carolina. That's the Tennessee River tributaries where most of our hydro fleet is located. Our coal plants, they're fairly dispersed evenly across the fleet. All you really need for a coal plant is some cooling water and a way to get the coal in there, so you can locate those in just about anywhere you can get the water. Our gas fleet's primarily in the eastern side of the system. This next slide shows the gas assets that run through the service area. You can see all the little stars up there are peaking plants. The blue ones are combined cycle locations. TVA is in an interesting location from a gas perspective. We've got a lot of long-haul gas pipelines that run through our service area, so almost all of our gas fleet's located in the western side of our service area, with one exception. We do have one combined cycle plant, our newest one up there in the very far eastern, northeastern part of the service area. That was built specifically to allow us to retire our coal plant up there. But TVA is lucky in that a little bit like Entergy, but not nearly as robust. But because we're located right in the middle of the traditional Gulf supply and the large consumer base up in the Northeast, we have a lot of long-haul gas pipelines that run through our service area. So gas has been fairly plentiful for us. So a couple of statistics about our power system operation. You can see our peaks. Our all-time peak back in 2007. You can see it almost mirrors our all-time winter peak from just back in January. Most of our history, we've been a summer peaking utility. Although in recent years, it looks like we've started to switch over to becoming a winter peak. We've hit 106 degrees since we had that summer peak, and the last time we hit 106 degrees, we only had about 31,000 megawatts of load. But when we hit that 7 degrees this winter, we hit that 33,352, and on top of that, we used a little over 1,000 megawatts of demand response. So had it not been for those demand response products, we would have set a new peak by about 1,000 megawatts. We have about $10 billion of revenue each year, and that last line there, we're very proud of our reliability. We deliver very reliable power to our customers. We're in our 13th year of being able to boast that we have 99.999% reliability. So I'm going to change gears a little bit now and go into my first topic I mentioned. I'm going to start by kind of explaining for you folks that don't do a lot of system operations how we go about deciding what generation we're going to use to meet the load, and whatever load that we've projected to use. And I kind of lead into how changing gas prices kind of flip that around on us a little bit and cause some issues that I didn't really expect to see. But what we do is we look at those generators that have the smallest variable cost. What's the cost of that being online versus it being offline, right? So you start with a nuclear fleet. Nuclear plants, although they are extremely expensive to build, you've heard some stats earlier today from some folks that are adding nuclear plants like we are. The cost of having a nuclear plant online and running at full output versus the cost of it sitting there offline, there's very little difference. There's not a material difference. So if you've got a nuclear plant available, that thing's running wide open all the time. Next, you'll see our coal fleet. Traditionally, our coal fleet's been our next most expensive generation type. Above that, you'll see a little slither of pumped hydro. On this particular day, most of our pumped hydro was in an outage, so we only had one unit there. And then above that, you'll see hydro. We typically put hydro up towards the upper end of our cost stack. And that seems a little counterintuitive, but Because if you look at the cost of producing hydropower, it is in fact the cheapest of our fleet. But you have this issue of fuel scarcity with hydro. You've only got so much hydro, and you're fairly limited in how you run it. So for us, the cost of hydro is cheap, but the value of hydro is fairly high. Because of the fuel scarcity, we typically value it up there towards the top of the stack. So it's layered in there on this slide right beside the gas. So what we try to do with hydro is we allocate what water we have in those most expensive hours. The next line, the big yellow line there, are combined cycles and IPPs, independent power producers. Those are those plants that we lease, typically in tolling agreement type arrangements where we supply them with fuel and take the power off of their bus bar. And then on top of that, the red line are combustion turbines. So basically you've gone up the stack in economic order, and it just so happens that just the nature of the technology, as you go up in price, you tend to go up in flexibility. The ability to start and stop them, how quickly they can respond to changes. But what happens when gas gets really cheap? If you flip this thing around a little bit and you suddenly put gas on the bottom, and that's happened to us a few times in the recent past where our gas fleet became cheaper than our coal fleet. Well, if you look at that, if you remember from the earlier slide, our peak's 33,000 megawatts, right? So on this day is 26,000. That's a typical kind of an average day at TVA. There's a lot of generation that's sitting on the sideline not being run today. We don't need it. In this scenario, that's generation that's sitting on the sideline are our coal units. And the previous scenario, or historically, it's been gas combined cycle, and CTs. So you say, well, okay, well, why does that matter? So, well, if you look at what it costs to start a coal unit, to cycle it, how long it takes to get a coal unit online, you'll see that for small coal units, and when I say small, I'm talking 150 megawatt, 200 megawatt kind of units, you're talking about $100,000 in rough estimate to start that guy, and it's almost a day to start it. If you're looking at a large coal unit, you may be talking $500,000 and over a day to start it, and that's just when the breaker closes. You know, you got to ramp up from there. Compare that to the gas combined cycle fleet where we used to carry our reserves. You know, you can start 1,000 megawatts of combined cycle and get it online in about 6 hours for what it costs you to start a 150 megawatt coal unit. So what we found when we were faced with these kind of situations, if you ended up with a week that looked something like this, and this is a graph of some peak loads over a week's time, you end up with this little situation where you've got one day of high loads. And you're looking at your fleet, and because you have those high cycle costs, you tend not to want to start any of these generators in no more than you have to, because you're simply not going to recover your startup costs, right? You're going to spend $100,000 up to $500,000 to start these guys, and you're really only going to get one day out of them. You need about a week of economic run to recover those start costs. And, you know, we do start them. We plan to meet that load, obviously. But the difference came when, if you come along about Wednesday afternoon or Thursday, and all of a sudden you get a bam, one of your big generators just came off. You know, breaker operation's about 5 cycles, right? So suddenly you've got a lot less generation. Or conversely, you may have 28,000 megawatts in your load forecast and you end up having 30. Well, the difference comes where before your reserve generation capacity was in gas combined cycle. You can make a couple of phone calls, 6 hours later you can have 1,000 megawatts on without any problem at all. Now you've got your reserve capacity in coal. If you have an issue Wednesday, maybe even Tuesday, certainly Thursday, that coal's out of the picture for that peak on Thursday. If you were to call for that unit, at best it'd be on by Friday, and your peak load's gone. Why even start it at all? So the issue that we saw was we would end up running some really tight operating reserve margins on certain days when we had some unexpected things happen to us that would not have been an issue in the past, back before gas became the cheaper fuel. Because now our reserves are in really slow units that take a long time to start and cost a lot of money to start. The second example that I plan to cover today is what we saw when we saw Entergy and some of the neighboring utilities making the decision to go into the MISO. And most of you may or may not be that familiar with that. Entergy and several utilities to our west, we are interconnected with them, and we are interconnected with the Midwest ISO. So what does that have to do with gas? Well, if you look at the portfolio breakdown between these two utilities, you'll notice that the Midwest ISO, the market, has a lot of coal in it. And Entergy is dominated by gas. And I say Entergy, I mean Entergy and the surrounding areas that went into the MISO. So when you have cheap gas scenarios, you can have a lot of gas down in Entergy trying to displace some of that coal up in the MISO. So you end up with a combined portfolio like this that's pretty radically different from the one that they had before. And you have generation that is very far away from the load that it's going to try to serve, and a transmission system that's really not designed right now to do that. So when we started studying Entergy, and when I say we, I'm a generation guy. Our transmission folks did all this study, and I appreciate all the work that they did. But we noticed that there was really only one physical tie between these two really large areas, and it could tote about 1,000 megawatts. So when we started studying the flow, we looked at what generation was down there and what would become some people call MISO South. We saw that there was over 50,000 megawatts of generation and only 36,000 megawatts of load in rough numbers. So you got a lot of excess generation available down there. And if you've got cheap gas prices, a lot of opportunity for generators to chase that coal capacity that's up in the MISO, even on your heaviest peak days. So when we studied it and did our own power flow modeling, we saw power flows that looked kind of like this, where power was flowing not just on that little 1,000 megawatt line that they had, but it was flowing through a lot of their neighbors as well. So several of the utilities got together. You can see the utilities that all came together. We call them the joint parties, and we started talking with MISO and Entergy, saying, we're doing some studies and we're seeing some potential reliability impacts from all of that power flow. And really it comes from situations where when gas is cheap, it starts trying to move north a long distance up into the Midwest ISO. This is a slide that kind of illustrates some of the studies that our transmission folks did. And you can see on the top half, in scenarios where you have cheap gas, we were studying and finding the overloads on our system. And when the power flow got up to around 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts, we were seeing some really significant overloads on our transmission system. We studied the opposite scenario too on the bottom, where coal's trying to get down and displace gas and Entergy. We saw some overloads, but not quite as high. But you can see we were seeing potential upgrades as much as almost $400 million. And if any of you have ever been involved with trying to build transmission lines and upgrade transmission, it's kind of like trying to do gas. It takes a long time to do that kind of investment, even if somebody's ready to write the check to do the upgrade today. So we got together with the MISO and we came up with an agreement where we agreed with MISO and Entergy that we would limit the flow between those two areas to no more than 2,000 megawatts as an interim step until we could come up with a better solution that would allow us to use a lot more science behind the limits. So we have a 2,000 megawatt limit, and if any of the joint parties are seeing transmission overloads on their system, they can call MISO and ask them to cut that flow back to 1,500 megawatts. So those limits were what the joint parties got out of it. What MISO got out of it was the ability to flow at least 1,500 megawatts anytime they want to, without any other constraints than would have been there without an agreement at all. This last slide is actually a screenshot from one of our operator tools. We keep this up in our control room for all our transmission operators. This shows the operators an update every few minutes of exactly what's flowing between those two areas. You can see when I took this screenshot, there was about 400 megawatts and it was flowing north out of Entergy into the MISO, or out of the MISO South into MISO Classic is probably the better terminology. And you can see where the power flow is relative to those limits that we were able to come to an agreement on. And that concludes my presentation.
Any question?
Amron, just curious if the transmission flow analysis was, it looks like it was done after the merger. Was any of that analyzed prior to?
It was prior to the merger. It was, and I apologize, I'm not a transmission flow guy, but most of the negotiation of this all happened prior to Entergy going into the MISO.
Any more questions?
With the changes that you had in the cheaper gas operation of your combined cycle fleet, did you find any issues with reliability then for those units that have been sitting idle for so long a period that has caused any concern with the operation and reliability of your fleet?
That is a really great question, and yes, we have. One thing that we have found is traditionally, if we had coal units available, they were running. They are not very good at sitting idle for long periods of time. You have people in the corporate office, we end up shaking our head. They're like, man, this guy has been offline for 6 months. He ought to have everything fixed in that plant. But the reality of it is you don't know what motor's going to start, what is going to work or not work until you actually go through the process, starting that thing up and running it. So we're switching to a mode of operation now where, and we're still kind of defining a time frame. So we're going to put a time limit on how long we're going to let those guys sit idle. We're going to put them on and run them at least annually, and probably more often than that. But yeah, that's a science that we're still working very hard at right now, is how do you lay these guys up and make them reliable when you want them to start?
Any more questions?